The new building is rather like a soulless new convention hall.
Yeah.
Even while these BJP disruptions are going on, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh was inviting the same leaders to breakfast to discuss what issues were troubling them. Is that now never bothered to come and talk to the opposition. Now we have had a government which has introduced terms like anti-national into the discourse. If you disagree with them, you're anti-national, you're unpatriotic. The BJP benches all stand on their feet and start saying Modi, Modi, Modi. It's kind of almost... How did the name India come about? It came about because the people beyond the river Sindhu, the Indus.
My last question, very important. What's the canteen food like? Important. I hope you're not announcing your retirement from politics. Dr. Tharoor, I wonder how many days of the year are you traveling?
Probably far more than is good for me. I mean, I've lost count, but certainly over 100 flights a year.
100 flights a year?
And not to mention countless hours on the road, especially in Kerala, where we don't have enough flight connectivity. So I'm on the move a lot.
Right.
More than is entirely good for me.
What does that tell you about India?
Oh, I think
people you meet and, such a diverse...
That's what keeps me going,
Yeah.
is that I find myself energized by the audiences. The questions are usually solicit questions that I don't really believe in monologues.
Yeah.
And I found that the audiences, what's on their mind, their interests, vary, but are usually of extremely interesting quality. And I find this perhaps in some ways more rewarding than sitting in Parliament and watching it being disrupted.
Which was actually my next question, because this is your fourth term. It's a new building. Is it a new environment as well, psychologically, socially, culturally? Do you get to gossip as much as you did in the old Parliament? What's it like, actually?
Look, I mean, there are really two questions on that. I mean, is the new building different from the old one?
Yeah.
Yes, it's certainly lacking the kind of character the old building had, which was redolent of history. The whole atmosphere went back, the first built in the 1920s to house the British Legislative Chamber and the British Raj, and then you look at all the oak paneling and the old portraits and the lower ceilings, which give you a greater sense of intimacy.
Right.
Yes, it was cramped, it was uncomfortable, you couldn't get up to go to the toilet without having to trip over half a dozen colleagues.
But there was a certain charm in it, right?
But there was a certain charm, and of course there was the central hall where people met and gossiped, as you put, and so on. Now, people are people, individuals don't change, so the gossiping may continue, but in less convenient circumstances. And I can tell you that the new building is rather like a soulless new convention hall.
Yeah.
And we have seen convention halls like this all over the country since Vigyan Bhavan came in and set the standard in Delhi. And I would say this is not an improvement on that. Perhaps with time it will acquire some character by use, by development of new traditions. But at this stage, there is a certain soullessness to it. I'm very conscious of what Justice Ramasubramanian said about soul, and he and I
and the spirit.
agree on the universality of the Atman, but I think that we can use the word soul in English metaphorically to speak about spirit plus something else, spirit plus a sense of indefinable character and identity that we speak of when we speak of the soul of India, the soul of Parliament, and this is still a soulless building. So on that issue, I would say that it's the newness is a disadvantage. In terms of convenience, it is certainly in some ways very convenient. For one thing, it's easy to get up and go and come back and so on. Remember, you have more leg room, you have more sitting room, the space is much bigger. It is less convenient in that there is no central hall anymore. There is a cafeteria, which is a good walk, including through some public spaces to get to it. There are kind of lounges on both houses, Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, where you can sit around, but very few people are seen talking to each other there. They're usually immersed because there's Wi-Fi there, and you're not allowed to use Wi-Fi in your chambers, and therefore you rush off to these lounges and check your messages or whatever. It's not yet the same sort of atmosphere. And finally, I think the real problem at the moment with Parliament is that over the years, and I'm not being partisan and blaming just the BJP. I would say over the last 20 years or so, we have seen a steady decline in what Parliament used to be or even should be. And it's now become increasingly a disappointing place to sit and work. It is characterized by very few high-quality debates. It is marked by excessively frequent disruptions. It no longer gives you the kind of sense which I must admit was already beginning to go down the tubes when I first came into Parliament 16 years ago, but which has been accelerating its decline since. It fails to give you the sense of the temple of democracy, the principal chamber of accountability of the government to the people, all of those things. Increasingly, what should be happening in Parliament is attempted to happen in the television studios, but the quality of that is another matter altogether, and you've been there, so I won't go there. So the net result is our democracy is suffering because of this decline in quality.
But there are still some high-quality speeches that we see. Maybe nothing of the stature of, say, when Vajpayee quit, after the 13-day government, or say when Omar said, I'm a Muslim, I'm an Indian. I mean, that 2008 speech, I think, is still very memorable. But there still are people who make an impact. Who would you say are your top 2-3 parliamentarians of today?
No, that would be invidious. I don't think it's right for me to pick specific colleagues. Everyone has had good moments. Some have not had a chance to have a good moment because of what's going on. And I will not name individuals. I will agree with you. There are people with great debating skill and ability who are there, but who often don't have an opportunity to showcase those skills enough. And yes, there are the occasional speeches with a certain virality on YouTube. And I've had a few myself that have gone fairly popular on YouTube and are still going around. But the truth is that for the most part, if you look back, say to my childhood, you had a number of people who acquired importance out of all proportion to the strength of their parties in Parliament only because of the way in which they use the floor of Parliament to challenge the likes of Jawaharlal Nehru and Indira Gandhi.
Firoz Gandhi, Pillu Modi.
You mentioned Vajpayee. There's exactly Pillu Modi. There's Aminu Masani.
I think Pillu Modi coming wearing that placard saying, I'm a CIA agent is still something of quite iconic.
That was memorable, but not particularly, he was cleverer than that, and he said some very funny things. Early on, there was Ramnath Lohia, there was Ram Manohar Lohia, I beg your pardon. There was Nath Pai, George Fernandes in his own way, Madhu Limaye. There were a number of people who really made their political reputations because of their effective use of Parliament. And for that matter, Firoz Gandhi challenging his own prime minister. Now, you can't imagine that happening today, where the whip system has made it impossible for parliamentarians to express their conscience when they disagree with their own parties. So you've got to a point. I mean,
Has that happened to you?
So, Kaveri, when I was a private citizen, after I left the UN and before I came into politics, Somnath Chatterjee invited about 15, 16 of us, so-called round table of eminent citizens, included people like Mr. Narayana Murthy, Shyam Benegal, me, a few others.
A few public intellectuals that we have.
From various walks of life. Yes, some public intellectuals, some scholars, even some retired or about to retire politicians, like, if I remember right, Vasant Sathe was there, but then he was no longer in active politics. And he asked us the question, as citizens, can you advise me how we can improve Parliament? I remember we had 2 days of discussions, and one of the things that we all unanimously said, not almost, we all unanimously said was, you have to take action to crack the whip on disruptions, because why should anyone be allowed to disrupt Parliament? To which his answer was that in our democracy, disruptions are often the only resort for an opposition to make its presence heard, and if I were to follow the rule book and expel them from Parliament, it would be undemocratic. And therefore, that option is not available. And then we had the same thing later when Meera Kumar was Speaker, and again, there was very serious amounts of disruption going on. And she had the same view, that she had the right in theory to expel, but she didn't feel it would be right to do that because Parliament had to be allowed to function.
Someone should tell Dhankar and Om Birla that.
It's very different now. So well, it's somewhat different now. Let me explain the difference.
Yeah.
Part of the factor was that in those days, of course, the opposition was more numerous.
Yeah.
So if you kept expelling people, you would essentially end up depriving yourself of almost half the House. And you would not have been able then to truly convince the public that you were acting democratically. But also for the ruling parties of the UPA, I think there was a presumption that in the interest of democracy, it was better to give in to the opposition in the interest of making the system work. That was, I think, the old school DNA.
Yeah.
The DNA that said, for example, that your parliamentary affairs minister would spend more time in the opposition benches talking to parliamentary leaders of the opposition parties than on his own side of the House. That was the way in which the Congress and I must
People
say,
like Pramod Mahajan, I think.
absolutely, Pramod Mahajan, when he was Vajpayee's parliamentary affairs minister, Kamal Nath and Ghulam Nabi Azad and the UPA, they would spend more time on the other side and they'd be talking and schmoozing, if you like, with the opposition leaders, but getting things done.
Right.
And even while these BJP disruptions are going on, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh was inviting the same leaders to breakfast to discuss what issues were troubling them and so on. What has changed in the last 10 years, you can say it's a difference of degree rather than a difference of kind, is that now, first of all, especially in the first two terms, the BJP had an overwhelming majority.
Yeah.
And they really felt that even if the entire opposition either walked out or was expelled, they would still have such a large number of people in the House, 2/3 almost, that it wouldn't matter and no one would consider them undemocratic. Maybe that's what they thought, but certainly their speakers had much less compunction about expulsions and much less willingness to adjourn. They would just let the bills be passed without debate amid the din rather than, so they were not so worried about appearing undemocratic. The second problem in the course of the last 10 years is the parliamentary affairs ministers, until this third term, never bothered to come and talk to the opposition. I mean, they would literally be issuing instructions, as it were, from the government benches. And so the result you saw was that there was a complete breakdown of communications and trust between government and opposition. We hoped that with the somewhat more close results of the 2024 elections, that there'd be more cooperation. I must say that there's been certainly a little more dialogue than there used to be, and a little more effort on their part to see what the opposition wants. But there's still been an awful lot of disruption, and there's still been a much less productive approach to the work of the nation. I have been dismayed to see in my 3 terms and the beginning of my 4th that increasingly the government just sees Parliament as a notice board to issue its pronouncements and as a rubber stamp of its own side, reinforced by the anti-defection law and the whip system, which means that even if there are MPs on their side who don't agree with some provisions or who are willing to see the merit in some proposed amendments, they'll still be steamrollered through. And the result of that, I think, has begun to undermine Parliament. You see, what was interesting was that in the old days, and I'm somebody who for my PhD, I read up hundreds of pages of parliamentary debates in the 60s.
What was your PhD on?
It was in Indian foreign policy making, so I was reading principally foreign policy debates. But when you're going through them, it's inevitable you get distracted by other debates as well. There's so much of rich material there. And I must say that it was very impressive to see both the quality of the argument, the intensity, and there was never the sense that there seems to be now, well, in any case, you're going to lose the vote, so how does it matter? I remember one particular memorable line of Vajpayee at a time when there were very few Jansangh members in Parliament.
When it was 2?
Well, no, not when it was 2, a little earlier, because my PhD was written before they were reduced to 2. It was the Jansangh days, they had a hand for maybe 40, 50, thereabouts, or 30, 40. But anyway, so he said to Indira Gandhi once, Madam, we have the arguments, you have the votes. And that was, so, but he said, I will still place my arguments on the record. I want the nation to hear what I have to say. And this is part of the logic of what this is all about. But part of the situation today, I think, is that there's much less opportunity. Many in the opposition seem to prefer disruption to debate, feeling that debate is futile because in any case, the government will get its way. The government has never taken the trouble in its entire, this 2 terms and 1 year of the BJP, they never once admitted an opposition adjournment motion, an opposition amendment to a bill, an opposition logical argument. I mean, it seems silly, but I can tell you when, for example, I remember when Ghulam Nabi Azad was health minister, And a suggestion was made on a particular bill by a doctor. I can't remember which party, but the doctor said that there's something in this bill which could have been improved if you had done this, this, and this, because this is not correct. The bill had been introduced. He took it back, discussed with his officials, amended the bill, and brought it back a few days later. Now, this has never happened in the BJP. And I can remember a very trivial example, but in the first few months of the BJP government back in 2014, they were still passing some bills which had been prepared and all the legwork had been done in the last days of the UPA. One of them was a bill which required companies, factories, establishments of a certain number of people or more to inform their workers of their legal rights in writing. So when that bill came forward, obviously in the previous government, I was only confined to my ministry, so I didn't know what was going on. I didn't know about this bill. But when the BJP put that bill forward, I spoke up and offered an amendment saying, look, this is an excellent idea, but remember that in our country, there's still large numbers of illiterate factory workers and so on. In addition to providing them their rights in writing, can't we also have a provision that they should be informed orally of what these rights are? And literally, I could see a majority of the BJP MPs nodding their heads in agreement while I said this. But when the bill came to a vote, the whip was immediately exercised, and the entire lot of them voted for that bill, which I think could have been improved by adding the question of oral rights if you were serious about conveying rights to workers. Now, this is a simple example and a trivial one because it doesn't change anything much that's fundamental. But it raises the question of, do opposition views matter? And increasingly the impression given to the opposition by the government is they don't matter. Now, all of this is bad for the country, bad for democracy. And the other thing, very sadly, we've seen is a breakdown of trust, not just a breakdown of communication between the two sides. There is a sense in which, honestly, in every democracy, government and opposition must start off with the basic presumption that each has the best interests of the nation at heart, but that they disagree about how to achieve it and what ideology to pursue in achieving it. That's what democracy is. Otherwise, you should just overthrow the system, attempt a revolution. It wouldn't be democracy. In democracy, everyone is agreed that ultimately the welfare of India and Indians is what matters. We disagree on how to get there. That's somehow gone. Now we have had a government which has introduced terms like anti-national into the discourse. If you disagree with them, you're anti-national, you're unpatriotic, you're treasonous in your conduct. And for the other side, there is increasingly this perception that they see themselves as the doubted, the doughty Pandavas, the embodiments of virtue against the evil machinations of the government, who are sort of this metaphorical and largely numerous, but adharmic Kauravas. Now, this kind of moral black and white on both sides means that you no longer just see yourself as adversaries, you see yourself as enemies. And that's can't be good for democracy either.
I wonder, when you meet privately across party lines, do the BJP MPs express this kind of view to you as well? Are they happy with what is going on?
Look, first of all, we meet much less together informally than we used to. I can tell you, during UPA time, it was entirely common, for example, for socializing during parliaments to involve people
regardless
of all parties.
Of what you said on the floor of the House, you were still
you were constantly in each other's homes and each other's events and so on. Very much less of it. Now, yes, people will still attend, say, weddings or occasions like that across party lines. But just sort of, going over for a dinner kind of thing, much less. In fact, I remember in my innocence early on, I invited a couple of BJP MPs. One or two first accepted and didn't come. And then I said, what happened? And then they felt very awkward. They said, look, we've been told not to come.
Really?
And then subsequently, I remember I made one more stab at it with somebody whom I had had very friendly interactions with, who was an MP on the other side and later became a minister of state. And she said, look, it's better for you not to invite me and it's better for me not to accept, quote, unquote. And
we'll spend the day guessing who it is.
So there's very much less of that sort of communication. And I must say that I think something is lost in that process. I never used to refuse an invitation from a BJP MP when I was a Congress MP or a Congress minister. Today, there are no invitations that I'm aware of by BJP ministers to Congress people. And I remember one or two ministers who keep saying, you must come home, we must get together. And so I'd say, yes, yes, yes. Never actually, the invitation
Typical
never followed.
Delhi polite
Never
tone.
actually followed.
Yeah.
So I'm not complaining. I don't really need the extra food, God knows, or the extra drink. But I think what I really value is, as you said, this informal conversation. So you have to ask them yourself, Kaveri, what they think. But I will say that there has also been a problem on both sides going back perhaps a generation now, 20, 25 years, where the philosophy has been on the question of parliamentary disruptions, where you stand depends on where you sit. So the very same BJP MPs who, while in opposition, used to spin elaborate theories about disruption was good parliamentary politics.
Yes.
Arun Jaitley
Arun
wrote
Jaitley was a master
articles
of it.
about Sushma Swaraj,
Yeah, yeah.
Venkaya Naidu. I can quote even L.K. Advani. They all said disruption is a legitimate parliamentary tactic, etc., and
yes.
strengthens democracy. All this sort of stuff. When the government is acting with misguided ways, why shouldn't we do this? The very same people came to power in 2014 and started bashing disruption as anti-national and so on. So, I mean, you can't take that. You know, I don't know how many of us here have been to missionary schools, but you learn the golden rule, right? Do unto others how you would have them do unto you. Well, in Parliament now, the golden rule is do unto others what they have done unto you. So now they're very busy. They're very busy saying every time that even within the opposition, some of us will raise our voice saying this disruption is not a good idea. They'll say, but look what they did to us. And that becomes ultimately an impossible argument to refute.
Does the atmosphere of Lok Sabha change when the Prime Minister makes a rare appearance, which he does?
It's far too rare. That's another serious problem. And when Jawaharlal Nehru became Prime Minister, he made it a point to attend every single day.
I believe he had a microphone in his room to listen into the...
That you can have. You
so?
can have TV sets in your
now,
offices
of course
now.
You can.
So you can
but
follow
I mean,
the
at that time, I suppose it
that
was
remarkable.
unusual.
And he came for every single day of every session. What is more, he obliged his cabinet to attend and he obliged the senior officials to attend. Today, the senior officials of the relevant ministries have to be there. Poor chaps, they have no choice. But I can tell you that ministers are only on a rotational duty basis, and the Prime Minister hardly ever comes. In fact, at one point, I accurately calculated and wrote a column about 7, 8 years into his term that he has actually spent more time in parliaments abroad than in the Lok Sabha, of which he was an elected member. Because he was making these speeches to countries' parliaments, but he was not prepared to attend his own Lok Sabha.
But Parliament itself is sitting for far fewer days, right?
That's whose fault is that?
Yeah.
It's the government that decides the sittings. We have gone from, I mean, in the days, in Nehru's first term, it was over 150 days a year.
Now it's 55.
And it averaged throughout the 1950s about 135 to 155 days. In the 60s, it was slightly less, but not much less. And it carried on right up to the beginning of the century as roughly in that ballpark. Today, it's really gone down. And in fact, I remember when Modi ji was elected, somebody telling me, do you know that the Gujarat Assembly only met for 56 days last year? Watch out. And I said, come on, they can't do that to Parliament. And they seem to be in the process of doing exactly that to Parliament. And I'm not even sure the Gujarat Assembly is even managing 56 days anymore.
Sorry, I interrupted you. I was asking you also about the mood. You know, what is it like when he actually does?
Well, first of all, I mean, a number of things have changed. He walks in and the BJP benches all stand on their feet and start saying Modi, Modi, Modi. It's kind of almost, I'm sorry, I mean, it's 1930s Germany practically, this kind of atmosphere. We haven't seen this before.
Yes,
standing up was there.
When
Manmohan Singh walked in, the Congress benches would stand up, but there was no applause, there was no sloganeering, there was no shouting. We're just showing respect by standing up, which is an old culture and tradition. But this business of shouting slogans and waving hands and so on, and it goes on sometimes for 3, 4, 5 minutes, is a bit embarrassing. But thereafter, yes, their attention is focused on the presence of the Prime Minister, partially because it is so rare, and partially because when he speaks, he is a compelling speaker, but he doesn't often choose to speak. In fact, we have this very unusual situation only under Mr. Modi, when questions addressed to the Prime Minister himself is not only Prime Minister, but has ministries under him directly, are answered by the Minister of State in his office. So Jitendra Singh, the question says, will the Prime Minister tell Parliament, blah, 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 and Jitendra Singh, the Minister of State, will stand up and answer the question. Whereas in our time, very often Dr. Manmohan Singh would himself answer the question.
History will judge him kinder, etc.
Well, he's already judging him more kindly,
Yeah.
I think, than his peers did.
Yeah.
So these are, again, all things. Look at the most popular things in the British House of Commons on which we were supposed to be initially modelled was indeed Prime Minister's question time.
Yeah.
We don't have anything like that. Arguably, we never did, so it's not just BJP's fault, but we don't get... But this time the Prime Minister doesn't even answer normal question hour on the questions to the ministries that he's officially in charge of. Then why is he in charge of them? That's really troubling. The other things we don't have that other parliaments have that might perhaps, for example, I've even suggested in an article somewhere that what we could do, for example, is to borrow this idea that several Western parliaments have of saying that one day a week the opposition will determine the agenda. So the whole problem, the reason the opposition has an excuse to disrupt, it's not the only reason, but the principal reason, is they say we want to raise a particular issue of compelling importance. The Speaker won't permit it under the adjournment motion, the government won't allow us to discuss it, so we disrupt because we don't want the government's business to go ahead, but they don't let our business go ahead. That's the logic. Now, if the government and the Speaker could reasonably say, government does not feel this business is that urgent. However, on Wednesday, it's your day, you raise it then. Or Fridays, or whatever it may be. Now, that could be a good solution. And then there could be an agreed code of conduct on the basis of that since the opposition does have the democratic right to set the agenda on one day of the week, that they are also prohibited from disrupting the other 4 days, which is in their own interest. Because look at what we get from Parliament. We can question ministers in question hour. We can raise our constituency issues in 0 hour. We can bring to the public matters of urgent public importance under what we call 377. Beg your pardon?
Lots of drama, lots of fire.
And you can debate, you can challenge, you can express your point of view. Even when you're going to be outvoted, you can lay for posterity a record that shows that you were right, which is what Vajpayee's logic was. That sort of thing you could do, and that ultimately benefits the opposition MPs, because as it is, when you're not in government, you're not able to deliver as many benefits for your constituents except through persuasion, wheedling, cajoling of government ministers. But at least you can say, look, I raised your issue in Parliament. Here is the video, or here is the text of the speech I made, in which I said that. But when you hardly have any chance to speak because the Parliament is disrupted most of the time, you can't even go and tell you people, see, I raised your issue.
So are your microphones really switched off, and how do they do that? I wonder. Does Mr. Dhankar have a button that goes...
The switching off of the microphone is indeed a prerogative. I'm surprised, honestly. I mean, I've never sat in the Speaker's chair, so I don't physically know how it works. But there is no doubt that it seems to me that...
Mr. Birla and Mr. Dhankar are using
the opposition MPs and particularly opposition leaders, when they're either saying things the government doesn't want to hear, or when they're speaking out of turn, or when they're seeking the mic to raise an issue that the authorities don't want them to raise, their mic does go silent. That is true. I've seen it far too often for the Speaker to really credibly say that he doesn't control the mic. It does go off.
The level of animosity between the chair and the members, especially of the opposition, is also quite unusual, isn't it?
It has definitely become worse over the years. And I think it is deeply, deeply regrettable, because ultimately you want to see your presiding officer as a kind of judge, to use an appropriate word this morning, as somebody who sits there, has essentially shed his political prejudices and is there to rule. But unfortunately, it's also part of the government's approach that there is a widespread perception. I won't make it as an accusation because I don't want to show any disrespect to the Speaker, but there is certainly a perception that the presiding officers of both houses receive instructions from the government, and what is more, are willing to receive them, which is not something that previous speakers would either have entertained or been required to entertain. I mean, how do you look at the stature of some of those speakers?
Yeah, I mean...
What do you tell us, Somnath Chatterjee? What do you tell...
Can you switch off the mic, please, when so-and-so speaks?
He was clearly... He was by far one of the senior most MPs, and both in sort of years of service and in terms of age. People looked at him with a great deal of deference, and no one would have presumed to give him directions. Even if a parliamentary affairs minister went to him and said, don't do this, he would have said, you give me your advice and I'll take my decision. That's the way he would have been.
How is your LOP? How is he performing, you think?
Well, what do you expect me to say? I think he's effective. Look, when he's there, when he has an opportunity to speak, he knows what he wants to convey, and he conveys that in his own way. There are all sorts of styles in Parliament. Not everybody speaks in the same way. Some of us have a sort of more forensic approach, as about marshalling a whole number of arguments and going bang, bang, bang. LOP's style is a little more discursive in that he will take one metaphor or one theme and expatiate on it for some length. But he does that very effectively, and many of his statements have entered our political lore in the last little period. I mean, you've seen, for example, I think one of the things that really stung, it was not even in a speech, it was in Rapati, in that he was making a speech early on in the Narendra Modi government, and he said something about your prime minister. And the BJP promptly stood up and he's your prime minister too. And then he said, yes, he is my prime minister, lekin wo kisan mazdoor ka pradhan mantri nahi hai. He is not the farmers.
That really stung.
Then that was the same thing which he said, this is a suit boot sarkar. And that phrase stuck. And you remember that there was this ostentatious suit and so on.
Yes, of course.
All of that was immediately auctioned, and the suit boot image was consciously dialed down because he made that stinging.
So Parliament matters at the end of the day.
I mean, to that degree, I mean, really, I'd like to think Parliament should matter for more than that, for all the other things I've mentioned so far. But yes, it certainly matters in that way too.
Yeah.
I mean, if frankly, we saw in the last House the expulsion of Mahua Moitra, if she hadn't been such an effective parliamentarian, that wouldn't have
come back, yes. And she was voted back.
She wouldn't have been expelled in the first place. It wouldn't bother if she didn't matter in Parliament.
Yeah. Could we have a couple of quick questions? Yes, two. We can't let Dr. Tharoor go without questions. I know people really do like to ask him. Yes.
Good morning, please. Dr. Tharoor. I'm Adil Beg. I teach economics. Already we spoke about how Parliament is functioning. We discussed the issues. You said the concerns. Everything is fine. But as a citizens of this nation, we can't be just seeing Parliament disrupting, and both the sides should take blame, both the treasury benches and opposition. So now we saw the issues. So what is the solution? What is the future? How we can change it? Like one solution you already said, one day for opposition. What are all the other changes that we can do to make it work?
So I will say that as far as this particular discussion is concerned, nothing, no suggestion that I come up with, and maybe that's what I should do, is write a column in the New Indian Express with suggestions for the future. But if I do that,
we have a column for you.
But no suggestion I come up with would be of any value unless the government buys onto it. See, our system, even constitutionally, I don't know if Justice Ramasubramanian will agree, but our constitution is already much more tilted towards the executive than most parliamentary constitutions are. But on top of that, we also have had over the last 80 years, or 77 years, whatever it is, now 78 years, an increasingly centralizing application of our systems of governance. And in the legislature, the government calls the shots. So if I were to suggest, for example, 1 day a week for the opposition, if I were to suggest the Prime Minister, say, once a month subjecting himself to parliamentary questions for 2 hours, if I were to suggest, for example, that Parliament, the opposition could reduce the number of adjournment motions it submits because it now has that 1 day a week. But if it submits an adjournment motion, that the Speaker will at least entertain a brief discussion on why that motion is important, instead of just dismissing it out of hand. There are procedural things like that, and I can give you 3 or 4 more if I sit down and think about it rather than just off the cuff, because what I would like to do is also borrow from the best practices of some of the other democratic parliaments. There are good systems involved. I will say that so far the committees have been working reasonably well, because the committees work away from the public glare. That is, that they're closed door, there are no cameras, no records. I mean, records are maintained for the parliament, but they're not issued in public. There are inevitably leaks from members to the media when an issue is particularly hot, but by and large, people don't use the committees to grandstand. So actual work gets done. If we can perhaps even create a provision for some in-camera discussions, that is closed-door discussions of some issues without the TV cameras, so that people will actually talk seriously rather than spend all their energies in posturing for the public. I don't know. There are various ideas. Let's see what can be done on the basis of what's done elsewhere. But all of this presumes a willingness on the part of the government to even admit this conversation. The government has shown no interest in seeking parliamentary reforms because at the end of the day, they get their way. And so if you are looking at the government saying, you know, the old line about man proposes, God disposes, whatever, here it's very much a case of, you know, the MPs propose and government disposes. So the government is going to decide whether any of this is feasible. So I can come up with ideas, and I probably will, now that you've put the thought in my head, but it's almost an academic discussion unless our government is actually prepared to say, yes, we want to make Parliament work better, and to make Parliament work better, we're willing to explore ways with you.
Another question? Karthikeyan?
Perhaps we could have a lady in the audience as well.
Oh, okay,
We should have some
sure.
gender balance.
Who is there?
We don't have enough in Parliament, so...
Yes.
Good morning, Mr. Tharoor.
There we
I'm
are.
Abhirami from MOP Vaishnav.
Hi.
And I have a question for you. It's actually about debates and the quality of proper parliamentary debate. So recently, something that made the headlines was about India's name change to Bharat, and it was also mentioned today. And we have seen a lot of scenarios where a country changes its name, and most recently, I think, Ceylon in '72. We have seen a lot of economic downfall after the name change. This is, according to me, this is a gold mine for parliamentary debate. Why doesn't the Indian Parliament want to take up and make a proper decision instead of, you know, kind of bringing it into an authoritarian regime?
Well, partly because, in fact, they never brought a bill. They could have brought a bill to the House, and that would have provoked a debate on the subject of the name. But they didn't, partially because the Constitution already calls the country India, that is Bharat. So using one or the other is equally acceptable. I happen to agree with you that this debate would be interesting, but actually rather pointless, because, in fact, Bharat is the name for the country in most Indian languages, and India is the name for the country in English, and that was a perfectly workable arrangement for a very long time. Why they want to tamper with it now? Now the president is issuing invitations to her reception saying the president of Bharat, which I find odd, to put it very mildly. But their objection to India is also completely preposterous. How did the name India come about? It came about because the people beyond the river Sindhu, the Indus, were the people who were given a name by foreigners, right? So the Persians couldn't pronounce the S. So instead of Sindhu, they would say Hindu. And so the people beyond the Sindhu were all Hindus. When the Greeks came, they also picked up this name Hindu. And so the name became India, in Latin, and in French, INDE, and so on for many European languages. And that's how it stuck. Now, what is particularly amusing is the same people who say that India is of foreign origin and therefore should not be used, forget that it is of the identical origin as the word Hindu, and they're going around saying, Garv se kaho ki hum Hindu hai. If you say Hindu, you can say India, because they both come from exactly the same origin, foreigners mispronouncing the river Sindhu. It's as simple as that. That's how Hindus are, and that's how India is. So if you can't say India, you shouldn't say Hindu. You can't go around saying, say with pride we are Hindu, and at the same time say, don't be proud of saying you're Indian. I mean, come on. It makes absolutely no sense. But then people don't really look at all of this with any great degree of intelligence. It's somewhat emotional talk. However, yes, if there is a debate, I will volunteer to speak in it.
What's your word of the year so far?
So far?
Yeah.
I don't know. I was told that the word of the year for one of these dictionary, Oxford, one of those, was brain rot.
Brain rot.
I think increasingly the danger of sitting in Parliament while it's being disrupted time after time is going to be brain rot.
What do you do when that's happening?
You see, I actually take my work very seriously. So I prepare for every single parliamentary question that's filed. I prepare for every bill that's listed for discussion. I come with notes. I come prepared to intervene or to object or to ask questions or whatever. So, I seethe with frustration. Many of the other MPs just go off and have a coffee or whatever while waiting for the period of disruption to be over. I tend to be one of those, I'm afraid, who goes off to the lounge with his Wi-Fi on the phone and starts doing emails and messages. Already I'm drowning in far too many messages. Or tweets, indeed,
Yeah.
or tweets as well.
My last question, very important. What's the canteen food like? Important, very important. And I believe you're very particular about your idlis.
No, I haven't eaten there often enough yet to pronounce authoritatively, but on the basis of a very limited sampling, I'd say it's not bad.
Okay.
I wouldn't say it's gourmet. I certainly wouldn't say it's inedible. In fact, I was just in one of my college alumni group in an interesting debate about how bad Rashtrapati Bhavan food used to be until Pranab Mukherjee's regime brought in ITDC to take over the kitchen. And you actually remember how bad the food was, because that's how bad it was. In Parliament, it never got that bad, but it wasn't great. Today, it's slightly better. I don't think anyone would sort of, go there in preference to going to the Chola, but certainly you would go there if you wanted a cup of coffee or a snack or a dosha or a vada, whatever, without feeling that you were doing any violence to your insides.
Great. Thank you so much. It's been quite an insight into how Parliament functions and
Thank you.
also the new Parliament building and what MPs do.
Thank you all very much. And yes, it's been interesting. And I must say that I don't mean to make people feel that they don't want to be in Parliament.
Yeah.
I just hope that a new generation will do better than some of us.
Right.
That you will still feel inspired. I may not want to go through this experience a fifth time after having seen so much of this
Really?
negativity.
I hope you're not announcing your retirement from politics.
No, not from politics. From contesting a Lok Sabha election. I've already said that in my constituency 4 times. And touch wood, thanks to the voters for victories, has given me enough to rejoice in. I think if my party wants to use me and the people want me to do things in politics, I'm still interested and willing. But sitting in a disrupted parliament time after time can be somewhat dispiriting. So what I'm urging is the young people who want to come forward, should get involved in parliamentary politics, but should come with different standards and ideals and try and prevent and do everything they can to avoid the disruption we've seen in recent.
Wonderful. We have to think of post MP employment from Dr. Tharoor, regular column, more frequent column in the New Indian Express, perhaps, Shantanu. Thank you so much.